Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz-Cohn, speaking to you from my office as Dean of the Pannonia Honors College at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is Dr. Diane Barnes, a physician who turned writer and actor after she suffered a life-changing stroke. Her one-woman show, My Stroke of Luck, has been performed all over the country, including here at Drexel. Diane Barnes' story is a fascinating and circuitous one. I think you'll enjoy hearing about it, and we'll want to check out her website, dianebarnes415.com, for a performance of My Stroke of Luck in your area. Diane Barnes, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
Well, thank you so much, Paula. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with your family history. You are a third-generation physician, which is unusual in itself, but particularly so given your family background. So tell us about that family going back 4 generations.
Oh, it is interesting. My great-grandfather was, on my father's side, was a slave on a Georgia plantation. And long before the Emancipation Proclamation, he decided he needed out, and he made his way to Philadelphia. He married a woman whose father had purchased the rest of his family from slavery with his earnings as a craftsman. And they had one son, which was my grandfather, William Harry Barnes. And somehow he decided at an early age he was going to be a doctor. I'm not sure what his inspiration was. But everyone teased him. They could see his kerosene lamp from the building, you know, in the tenements where African Americans lived, and they could see the light, and they teased him all the time. What does he think he's doing? Well, what he did was win a scholarship to University of Pennsylvania Medical School, the first African American to do so, graduate, the first, and then while he was in practice, he decided he wanted to be a specialist in ear, nose, and throat. Well, it was the Jim Crow era. And you could practice all you liked, but you could not get training. So he found that the best experts were in France. He learned French, took a steamer to France, trained, came back and became the first African-American certified in any board specialty, which was ear, nose, and throat in, I think it was 1927. He had 5 sons, poor guys. And I say poor guys because 5 sons of a man like that, you're going to get the dose of, you know, we can do it, and you need to be resourceful and go for what you want. And my dad was, I think, the 3rd of the boys, and 2 of them became physicians. My dad was an internist. His brother, Leroy, was a radiologist. And originally, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I spent in my childhood, my chore for my dad was to tear out all of the advertisements from the journals that were sent to physicians because he thought they corrupted you and made you want to buy those and prescribe those drugs. And so I was fascinated, you know, all of the images and dermatology, odd skin conditions, whatever. I was totally fascinated, but I liked animals. When I worked for a veterinarian, my allergies became very bad, and I realized that wasn't going to work. So, medical school, here I am.
So were you influenced by your uncle, who was a radiologist? You became a diagnostic radiologist.
Radiologist, yes. I think the independence that he found in his work and the puzzle of it. And I was like him in that I loved the intellectual puzzle, the Sherlock Holmes aspect of it.
Less than the people aspect.
Oh, you betcha.
Yeah. Which is interesting. We'll get to that because things changed after your stroke.
Life changes.
So you grew up in New York City, and you were a stellar student. Yeah. You went to the best schools.
I had the advantage of a good education.
Yes. And so did you always believe you were going to be a doctor? I mean, it sounds like no. Veterinarian was
veterinarian was a dream. And if I weren't a veterinarian, I have no idea. I had no other, there was no plan B. I knew I loved medicine, and I loved the autonomy of you know, a woman. There were so few options for women in those days. Yeah. And I wanted to walk in a career where my mind would be my currency, where longevity in the career would be an advantage, not a disadvantage, and where no one could really stop me if I used my mind and education.
And you had an education that was exceptional. I mean, you went to Stanford, you went to Yale Medical School. I wonder, I mean, we think of that as, I mean, that was a tremendous privilege, and yet I imagine that there were difficulties attached, tensions and difficulties also, given that you were African American, and then you also had this genealogy to live up to. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, about the genealogy to live up to, I didn't feel so, you know,
didn't
it's
feel
like,
the pressure?
I didn't feel the pressure. You know, my dad had only girls. So he was, for him to have 2 doctors come out of 3 girls was pretty amazing.
It is.
So it didn't feel like so much pressure.
You think being a girl, actually, that's an interesting
made it
point.
yeah.
Made it easier
Yeah.
because you weren't, nothing was expected
Right.
of you.
I mean, they expected me to become educated and to use and to be self-sufficient and use my education. But that was to take care of myself. You know, that was survival. And so when I said I'm going into medicine, he was like, okay then. But it was not something I felt pressed to do. Now, the pressures, the other issues of class, race, and sex in school in those days, I think we've talked a little bit about sometimes it's easier just to put your head down, hunker down, and go for it.
Push through.
Push through.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there were slights and obstacles and downright sexist, racist things that happened.
Do you find that they come up more in your memory now, perhaps, than when you were experiencing them firsthand?
Absolutely. So, and certainly with the Me Too movement, a number of things came up which were best ignored at the time to survive. But it's interesting, since my stroke, I'm much more aware of the lack of humanity in people's interactions. So I'm actually more bothered by injustices and slights than I was before.
You're more sensitive, maybe, or
More sensitive,
attuned.
more attuned to it, and more, why? What are you doing? We're human beings. Don't you see me? Can't you let me see you? It's just a different, just a different.
A different dynamic. So you raised 2 boys by yourself. It's like you've had challenges. And we haven't even gotten to your stroke yet. And I want you to tell us, first of all, a little bit about the challenges you've found with single motherhood and what precipitated or what motivated you to take on that challenge to begin with.
Well, what motivated me was I was in my late 30s without a long-term partner, without a husband, and I had decided I wanted kids. Now, I didn't want kids in my 20s or early 30s. And I did have a therapist say once, Diane, if you don't want something until it's almost impossible, maybe you need to look at why you want it.
Yeah. Maybe you always have to wait until it's almost impossible.
That's sometimes, and I think that's true, that the reality, once you hit up against reality, it's now or never. It's like, oh, whoa. But also, I was a changed person. By then I was, I finished my training, I had a faculty position, I was in a secure private position that I was capable in. I had, I had reached my career goals. And I wanted kids. So, there are 2 choices at that point, right? Adoption or get knocked up. And I chose adoption. And, I also had this feeling that, it would be interesting to dip into another gene pool. It's kind of a funny, wacky thing to say.
You say that
but
in your play.
I do say that.
Yeah.
And
What's
there's
the surprise? What will
surprise.
happen with this person that doesn't have my genes?
Yes, and doesn't have all the expectations in our family. Because even though I didn't feel the pressure as I think a male would have, certainly there were issues of, in our family we do this, in our family this is expected, in our family. So the high achievement was, my parents didn't come to my graduation from Stanford. I was told, in our family, graduating from college is no accomplishment. You'll have to graduate from something else if you expect us to come. Which was a bit harsh. I went to my children's kindergarten graduations, But
that's fascinating. I think that is, I know other people with that particular ethos where it's so achievement oriented that certain achievements are dismissed.
yes.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that none of that residual sort of spilled out And it was a challenge, but it was delightful. I mean, it was obviously, I had the means to have nannies and live-in help, which I desperately needed.
Yeah.
But
And you continued working, of
I
course.
continued working, yes. And it never felt overwhelming until
Until your 50s. And I don't know the age exactly when you suffered a stroke.
exactly.
And that was a just cataclysmic event in your life.
Yes.
So tell us about the first manifestation of the stroke you suffered in your 50s and how you responded to it.
I was riding my horse, and he stopped listening. And so I got off to reestablish control, which is the best thing to do when you're riding a 1,500-pound tank of muscle. And as soon as my feet hit the ground, I had the worst headache of my life. Now, I'm a radiologist, and my entire career, I had read CAT scans, worst headache of life. There's one diagnosis, hemorrhagic stroke from a ruptured aneurysm or an AVM, vascular malformations, essentially. They burst. You're born with them, or some people, they're acquired, and they burst. That's your first sign very frequently that they exist. Some people have headaches ahead of time, some people don't. So in 30 seconds, my life flashed in front of my eyes.
You knew right away.
Well,
Or did you know?
I thought, no, my first thought was, okay, I've been hit by lightning. But I looked up.
And the sky was clear.
The sky was clear.
Okay.
And then I knew. It felt like Thor's hammer. I mean, I think the first thing was lightning, okay, Thor's hammer, and then a few other mythological references, and then I knew. Now, how did I behave? Was it your next question?
Well, yes. How did you respond?
Let's
Yeah.
start with
Yeah.
do as I say, not as I did.
Yeah.
Because what I did is go into massive denial. I think that's the only way to describe it. That kind of stroke, unless if you fall out on the ground, many people do. It bursts, they have a headache, boom, out, you lose consciousness. If you have only a headache, no one around you has any idea that you've had a stroke. Unlike the other strokes where your facial droop or your tongue goes to the wrong side, you can't speak. This kind of stroke, only the victim or the survivor knows. And I drove home. I took a bunch of Motrin and went to bed. Incredibly stupid. But I felt that I was going to die, and I wanted to die where my children could find. And the next day, I got up and drove my younger son to camp, which was the stupidest thing in the world to do. But I tried to get him a ride, and I couldn't, and I'm a single parent, it's on me. And then I drove to the hospital all the time, my head absolutely splitting. And I was put straight from there into an ambulance. After I had a CT scan, straight to an ambulance to neurologic intensive care, where I stayed for a week.
It's amazing to me that this was how many years ago?
13.
13, and you have performed this, and yet it's still, when you think of this memory and your act of denial, and also, I guess, your relationship with your kids during it, it
Yes,
overwhelms you.
It does. It's, well, the stupidity of it, the risk, and the degree my thinking was already disordered from the
that's it.
brain injury.
Sure.
And I know that this happens to other people for other reasons, not so much either somebody doesn't believe them, they say, I've got to go to the hospital, and so over the years, I've accumulated a lot of stories of other people who've happened what I had. So all that's also in there.
It's common for doctors, I don't know if in this particular case, I know doctors tend to deny illness in themselves, but strokes, do you think this is actually common? Really? You've heard other stories then?
Yeah, sadly. I think that's why I said, do as I say, not as I do. Because yes, I think we tend to delay treatment. And many women, when they show up, just like Serena Williams found. She's had pulmonary embolus before. She said, I can't breathe. And still she had to fight to show she had a pulmonary embolus, which is a fatal condition. So all that's wrapped up in there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, your show dramatizes this brilliantly. A one-woman show in which you take us through this process. And play different roles and dramatize something so complicated. I mean, that's really the brilliance of it, because you wrote it as well as perform it.
Thank you.
So, and it's titled My Stroke of Luck. Brilliant title.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the idea being that ultimately the stroke had a positive effect on you. And looking at you now,
Yes.
I can see, I mean, that you are a thriving human being. Tell us specifically about the phrase, my stroke of luck.
Okay. First, I have to give credit to Howard Meehan, who was my comedy mentor and fellow Meisner-trained actor, who suggested that title when we were playing around. And it absolutely seemed perfect. Because the changes, the stroke, hitting absolute bottom, not knowing who you are, not being able to speak, not being able to be understood, and losing a piece of the left brain, which is much more of the analytical side, opened a whole new world to me. I can't discount the effects of rehab, having to relearn things everyone takes for granted, including you. You know that once you were a capable human being and you're reduced to what felt like nothingness. But it was an incredible opportunity to be grateful for being alive, for being spared, and to relook at everything. And some of it was my brain doing it. I mean, I would have memories, and I didn't know if they were memories or dreams. It was like somebody took, I used this line in the play, like my life had been a movie, and somebody was just cutting it up and re-editing it and giving it a whole new spin and a whole new sound effect and a whole new color palette. And to be given a chance to be born again and to understand the fragility of life, that's huge.
What an interesting metaphor. I mean, of the film being recut, because we don't usually, we're so stuck in our narrative, and you were given an opportunity to have a new movie about yourself.
Yes.
That's very liberating. I mean, also you were able to take advantage of it.
Sure.
But this whole right-brained, left-brained business, so you were very left-brained. I always have to get those straight. Left-brained is more analytical, more rational, more task-oriented. And the stroke actually affected the left part of your brain? Mm-hmm. So literally, you had to become more right-brained.
Yes. Yeah.
So which is more creative, more intuitive, and so forth.
Yes, and there is some interplay between both sides, but there's no question that instead of approaching things analytical, problem-solving, thinking, it's much more an intuitive, process-oriented, global, impressionistic world. I mean, it's sort of like it's like Monet from the Renaissance, you're living a different world.
So from being a doctor, you became an actress and playwright and writer.
Right.
Do you think that was always there? Do you feel the creativity? I mean, it must have been. You always had that right brain.
Yes.
Do you think that you could have accessed it without the stroke?
Possibly. As successfully, I doubt it. Because self-critics and perfectionism are things that kill creativity. But yes, I think to some degree my father had a brother who was an architect and painter. And for a while, I mean, I always dabbled in did things. I did sculpted and I always journaled. And there was definitely, there'll be none of that artsy-fartsy stuff in this household, in my family.
Really?
Yes.
So everybody was left-brained in your family?
No, everyone wasn't, but
your mother was?
Yes. And the requirement was that we find that kind of linear pathway. But I think certainly the seeds were there. But I think in many of us, the seeds of many things are there, and they never get nurtured, and they never get the chance to grow.
Wow, it is so interesting to see. Now, do you feel that it also changed your relationship to people?
Oh, yes.
Your interpersonal skills or interests and so forth?
I see people differently. I connect differently. I still have the New York perspective of being able to look at appearances and make judgments, but they are much less a part of what I see and feel. I'm much more able to relate to what feels like someone's essence or heart.
So you're less critical.
I'm less critical, and I'm much more engaged. I mean, one of the reasons that I find this world of performance so fascinating and thrilling is that I can feel that I'm touching people, even if I can't see them in the dark. Whereas in my old life, I was reading films in the dark, not touching anyone or anything, and closing the book and going home. And
Reading the radiology
Yes,
films,
yes.
Well, I will say that when you performed last night here, there were so many people in the audience who related to some strand of your story. And there was even a stroke victim who was so empowered by your story, I felt, that it was inspiring for everybody there. I'm sure you have had incredible stories from people in your audiences.
Yes, and I usually get emails at my website over the course of the month that after any performance that are just incredible. People who couldn't speak or at the time they left the performance. So it's a wonderful, I feel like the world has a much more open heart than I ever saw it before.
How did your boys respond?
Well, at the time, they were only 12 and 14, and the 12-year-old was in boarding school, had been in boarding school already for a year. So he was fairly well spared. He just felt there was nothing there.
That's still pretty traumatic.
Yes, he was angry and abandoned.
Yeah.
My older son, who was living with me, was just left adrift because I was not there, really. The person he knew wasn't there. Now, it's a very healing. Having done the show, both of them having seen it, it's been a very healing experience for the whole family, and I think we're all stronger for it.
You performed here at Drexel. It was a wonderful performance. I wonder if you could perform a snippet of it for our audience here.
Okay. It's Saturday, July 2nd, 2005. I'm off for the holiday weekend. No beeper and not a chance of being called back to the hospital. My boys, now 12 and 14, have gone to see War of the Worlds, so tonight I'm flying solo. The evening is glorious. The sky painted orange and red as the sun nestles into the horizon. Mosquito hawks swirl in the bright fluorescent lights of Novato Horsemen's Arena. And tonight, for the first time, I'll be competing on my own horse, Dr. Z. He's mine, all mine. We start in a gentle lope. He spots the herd, and the way he tosses his head and neck, he is one cow pony happy to be back at work. I've spent the last 3 months getting to know Dr. Z, and now we're a team with me, the head honcho, which is pretty amazing. This 1,500-pound tank of muscle, a huge prey animal, the largest eyes of any land mammal, on either side of his head, primed to flee from danger, has accepted me, a myopic apex predator who smells like the meat I eat, as his leader. I look right, Z takes me right. I look left, we veer left. Little squeeze of my thighs, we pick up speed. Lean back, whoa, and we stop on the proverbial dime. And then we're loping again, all muscle and readiness. Tonight is my night. We're gonna win this one. Suddenly, Z slows to a walk. Hey boy, come on, pick it up. He turns right. Hey, crosses the arena, stops in front of Jimmy, our veterinarian. Hey, Diane, you're supposed to be warming up. There a problem? I don't know. Z isn't listening. Ow! Oh, I have the worst headache of my life. Surely only a lightning bolt could feel like this. But the starry night sky is clear. I know, and Z knew, sensed before I had a clue.
So what are you? You are now. You are a writer and an actress. I know you've gone on auditions for
Yes.
other people's work,
Yes.
and I guess you will be performing in other people's work. But you're also working on your own next
Yes.
piece.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, I have two projects now. Number one is a memoir. So, My Stroke of Luck, the memoir, a book, which I hope to make significant progress on this summer. And I also have started a second show about my growing up, which is basically about the intersection of class and race and expectations in the 50s and 60s as I was coming up.
Now, your sisters, your mother is no longer alive. Are you concerned about how they will respond to telling of this story?
No, not really. I mean, the thing about being a writer is you have to tell your truth.
Yes. Yeah, a writer is somebody who has to be fearless in so many
Yes.
ways.
Yes.
And you are.
I try to be.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much for being here. Thank you for performing at Drexel. I think it was greatly enjoyed.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview.